Good evening, my name is Christian Garcia, and I'm going to discuss cultured meat. I learned about this topic last year when I was in agriculture, taking an agriculture class, just an introduction class, but someone actually spoke about this and I thought it was very interesting, so I decided that for this I would pursue this topic. For those of you that don't know, which might be actually quite a large amount, cultured meat is meat that is artificially produced by extracting the stem cells out of the cow's muscle tissue, and then they're placed in a petri dish where they're exercised and they're fed nutrients in order for them to actually produce a meat product. And according to the Food Agriculture Organization of the United Nations estimates that the demand for meat is going to increase by more than 2/3 in the next 40 years, and current production methods are not sustainable. This is according to the Maastricht University. This is where the professor who actually produced this first sample of the cultured meat, this is where he teaches, so this comes right from the roots. This is where I take my stance, and I claim that cultured meat will in fact prove to be more sustainable to the population, the human population, and to the animal population, than it is the current meat production system right now. So I'm going to prove those by the claims I make, in which cultured beef is much healthier for the consumer. In addition, I'm going to address how cultured meat requires much less resources. And finally, I'm going to address how cultured meat is less destructive to the animal kingdom. So cultured beef this is the first point I'm going to address. Cultured beef is healthier for the consumer in the sense that it has less fat, due to the fact that we extract the muscle tissue, which also they can extract the fat tissues, or fat cells, in order to produce fat. But they wouldn't want to make an all-fat one, but that's the reason why this will be much healthier, because there is in fact no fat in the meat that they produce, because it's all the muscle, which is a good source of natural protein, and it's not as unhealthy. So they can actually flavor this though with the fat cells. They could do like a hybrid of both by mixing some of them, and then they have to do the exercise and the feeding them. So this is it's also very interesting, because according to Mark Post, who's the guy who created this invention of a hybrid, or not hybrid, but of the stem cell burger, so you could call it, he said we gain greater control of what the meat consists of. For example, its fat content, and that, as I previously addressed, we could either incorporate some of the fat cells or none at all, depending on your preference, which is good for a customization of how healthy does this person want to eat. And that depends also on the flavor. So one that's like 100% with no fat, that's not going to be very delicious. It's already been proven, but that can obviously change. And as a follow-up to that, in an article that Zaraska produced, she quotes a nutritionist that says if they're going to make their own fats, they will be able to replace saturated fatty acids with, for example, omega-3 fatty acids. This is also very important, because we don't even have to use actual animal fat, and we can instead use fats that are healthier and will prove to be more beneficial to us. In addition to it being healthy for the consumer, I'd like to address that there is less chance of a decontamination, or less chance of contamination in the food. This is due to the fact that they are in fact in cultures, so they're in a laboratory that's protected. Here's a quote from a guy who works for PETA. He interviewed with Genovis, and he says that aseptic cultivation of cultured meat would increase food security by mitigating risk associated with disease transmission, V8 manure production, and antibiotic use, and eliminate the spread of fecal bacteria casualty of foodborne illness. So this proves that there will be more sterile meat that we can eat that won't be harmful to us. My second point I would like to address is that cultured beef requires much less resources for us, which will prove to be more beneficial as the human population continues to grow. So it requires very little water input, is the first comment I would like to make on this. And it says, according to Tumisto and the Natos, 82% to 96% lower water usage than its animal agriculture equivalents. This is mainly due to the fact that animal production agriculture has to deal with the land, the land that they live on, the food that they have to consume, so they have to take into account the land that's used for producing the food, and that's why it requires so much less water. And these are actually significant numbers. It's not like 25% less water, but this is if it was in fact to go all cultured meat. So that would be a long process then. In addition, it requires less land use, like I was previously saying about the materials and how the resources are preserved. It says research carried out at a University of Oxford suggests that producing cultured meat could use as much as 99% less space than what is needed for current livestock methods. That's also important because as the population grows, we're able to use the land that is devoted to currently to the animal agriculture production. That could be used for us. So 99% less space is actually extremely a lot. But it makes sense because if they're grown inside of cultures in a lab, then they're less likely to need as much space. And my final comment I would like to make is that cultured beef is less destructive to animals. It only requires a single cow to have its stem cells extruded from. So this next quote comes from New Harvest Org, which is also funded by the guy who created the cultured meat. A single cell could be used to produce enough meat to feed the global population per year. That's pretty dramatic. So as opposed to all these cows we used to eat, we all have one cow that we need to live off of. And I would just like to state that cultured beef is more substantial to us than it would be if current meat production.
All right, well, the topics identified, I like the fact that you give a little justification at the beginning for why you're talking about that. That makes it a more interesting presentation. You define the idea of cultured meat to some degree. The whole idea of stem cell production of this sounds intriguing, although the question about how that actually operates, I think, probably is still a little bit vague. It makes it sound like you're growing meat, and maybe that's exactly the way it works out, but there's not a very clear explanation of it. And the reference to the research that's being done doesn't necessarily, we've got a lot of examples or experiments that people are doing, but the idea that we can generalize from those at this particular point, I think, is a little premature. I think you need to have a lot more data to be able to sustain your argument. You talk about it being sustainable, for instance. The very first question that popped in my head was probably the one that you didn't answer, and that's the cost issue. So if this is going to be affordable, then maybe everything else falls into place. If it's not affordable, then I think there's an issue that pops up here. The idea that it's going to be healthier in the long run, I thought that was explained pretty well. You can manage that. And you actually have some rebuttal issues built into some of the arguments there about flavoring and taste and all that sort of stuff, because I'm thinking I don't want fat-free bacon. That's the whole point of eating bacon, is that it's filled with fat. So, but apparently you can make some adjustments about that sort of thing, or at least at the moment. This would be one of those things where if we had, an example from the study, here's reporting on it in the press. We've got very vague references to what's going on here. If they're serving it at a restaurant someplace as an illustration, that would be so much easier an example to point to and be able to make some sense out of. It was a little bit confusing because it sounded to me like you had 2 second points, and my guess is that the first of those is actually one of the supporting points of the earlier point, and then you have another second point. So it's just labeling got a little bit confusing in the body of the speech, but I could see that you're following a pattern, and you did have a preview that set up a pattern. So when I went back to that, it made a little bit more sense. The notion that it's going to be requiring less resources, well, you mentioned water particularly, but I'm not sure what other resources would be involved. It certainly sounds like there are going to be some scientific resources that have to go into this, but we don't get much explanation of what that is, and I think that that's a place where people would have some reservations about this going in. And then the animal input, I got to be honest, I'm always suspicious when there's a little hyperbole involved. And in 1976, I remember reading a quote that said, just 1% of the sun's rays that reach the earth every day would be able to power everything for civilization constantly. And I'm going, oh, well, that's pretty interesting. Here we are 45 years later, and I'm still waiting for that 1% to be harvested that's going to solve all those problems. And you're telling me that a single cell from a cow is going to provide enough meat to sustain people in the future, and I'm going, that sounds like a little bit of an exaggeration, at least at this point. I mean, I can understand the theory behind it, but you're making an argument that's more than theoretical in nature. You're making an argument that says this is the future. This is going to save our tails, or I was going to say it's going to save our bacon, but I've already done one bacon joke, so that doesn't really seem appropriate. I did like the fact that you referred to the researchers and you quoted them and cited the experiments that they're doing on this, and they addressed some of the reservation issues. Like I said, I think I need stronger evidence to indicate that this is practical and sustainable. I know they're addressing what they think are the doubts there. And like I said, the one big doubt that I have is the economic cost. And then the other thing that popped in my head right at the end, I said, holy criminy, people are having trouble with GMOs in their potatoes. Imagine what it's going to be like that you're going to eat, genetically modified meat. And, they talk about Frankenfoods. This is the ultimate Frankenfood. Frankenburger. All right, thank you.